students. Welcome to the 6th Relativism lecture. We have Navdeep Johar with us. I would call him a movement thinker. He's not just a dancer, choreographer, yoga practitioner. And that is exactly why he's here to talk about physical traditions is continuing. The series Cultures is continuing. And we are very happy that we have Uma Chakravarti here to chair this lecture. She will tell you a little bit more about Navdeep and his course. I'll just mention why this lecture is part of this series. Living a range of things, thus forging a certain
those who do not believe in the Vedas and not necessarily those who don't believe in God. The Charvakas. Historically, the Charvaka movement is the first confrontational school of thought that openly challenges and to a degree succeeds in disrupting the Brahminical order of thought, practice and control, and actually puts it on the defensive. They not only reject but ridicule the philosophical propositions of the Brahmins and the hegemony of the Vedas, claiming that religion is a human invention. I quote here from the Brahaspatya Sutras. The Charvaka system is attributed to a thinker called Brahaspati, who is ostensibly a Brahmin himself. He says, "There is no heaven, no final liberation, nor any soul in another world. Nor do the actions of the four castes, orders, produce any real effect. The Agnihotra, the three Vedas, so it's still the three Vedas yet, not four Vedas yet. This is the 8th century BC. The three Vedas, the ascetic's three staves, and smearing oneself with ashes, were made by nature to the livelihood for the livelihood of those destitute of knowledge and rigor. If a beast slain in the Jyotishtma rite will itself that inference cannot be employed for establishing any dogma regarding the transcendental world, or life after death, or the law of karma, which cannot be available to ordinary perceptual experience." Close quote. They also dismiss the idea of supernatural causes to describe natural phenomena. To them, all natural phenomena were produced spontaneously from the inherent nature of things. I quote here. Brahaspati says, "The fire is hot, the water cold. Refreshing cool is the breeze of the morn. By whom come this variety? From their own nature was it born." So this whole thing of spontaneity, nature. So they are drawing attention upon attention away from intellectual concepts that according to them are faultily, if not deceptively, contrived or imagined, and bring the focus onto experience and the effect. I would say that the success and the impact of the Charvakas lay not in their strident challenging, but in equally proposing an alternative methodology of seeing and experiencing. So they not only disrupt the Brahminical mode, but also inject creative doubt and instigate inquiry. Plus, they are doubtlessly convincing, because they are called the Charvakas. That is, Charuvaka, meaning sweet talkers, because of the substance of what they are proposing, as well as their persuasive abilities. It is important to share that the Charvakas are not just rebels without a consequence. Out of this school of thought, many Nastika traditions of philosophy emerge, most prominent among them being the Ajirikas, who like the Charvakas disappear around the 13th century CE, the Jains, and the Buddhists. In fact, the Buddha, the most, quote, godless and most godlike personage, is called a Charvaka, while in the Mahabharata, a villain is named a Charvaka. In the 13th century, when Mahadevacharya, the 12th Jagat Guru of the Sringeri Sharda Peetham, puts together the Sarva Darshana Sangraha, a compendium of Indian philosophy that lists 16 darshanas, he places Charvaka as number 1 and Vedanta as number 16. It can be said that the Charvaka is the first school of thought that initiates a challenging inquiry that eventually results in Vedanta, which literally means Ved Anta, the end of Vedas. Or it can be said that it is perforce it's the reinvention of the Vedas that cannot. I'm sorry. This line's not making sense to me. I'm sorry. As we all very well know, that Vedanta is profoundly introspective and its inquiry into Brahman is unparalleled, but the pragmatic end of Vedanta, like all organized religion or religious orders anywhere in the world, does assert control. It is both moralistic and discriminative. The discrimination between castes may be underplayed, but it discriminates on the ground of karma, papa and punya, and I would even say dukkha and sukha. It might also interest some to know that by the 16th century, the 16 darshanas that included Buddhism as well as other many religions are pared down to 6, as we now know them as the Shat darshanas, namely Sankhya, Mimamsa, Nyaya, Visheshika, Yoga and Vedanta. So within 3 centuries, from 16 they come down to 6. A point to note is that all these categorizations of darshanas are all from the perspective of Vedanta. As an aside, I would also like to add that the Charvaka only recognizes 4 elements. This is an aside, and I might be able to talk about this. So they say that there is no ether. There's only 4 elements: water, air, fire, and blood. And go to Sankhya now. It would not be incorrect to say that Sankhya is one of India's nodal and most abiding philosophies. It is attributed to sage Kapila, who was approximately dated around the 8th century BCE. However, the Sankhya texts, that is the Sankhya Sutras and the Sankhya Karika, emerge only a few centuries later. Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita says that, I open quote, of all trees I am the banyan tree, of all the sages among the demigods I am Narada, of the Gandharvas I am Chitraratha, and among perfected beings I am the sage Kapila. So this is how important Kapila is and the Sankhya system is. This is a time when the propitiatory mode of evoking and harnessing Vedic gods, who can be even called nature gods, such as Indra, Agni, Varuna, is now turning more introspective and inquisitive. I would say that there seem to be 3 chief strands of inquiry that pretty much span through the millennium before the beginning of the Christian era. These 3 being inquiries into, number 1, the cause of existence. Second, the legitimacy of methods proposed by various schools to gauge and glean the supersensible nature of this cause. And 3, and finally, most importantly, the abiding inquiry into the elimination of dukkha. In fact, the inquiry into the cause and the termination of dukkha could be said to eventually be one and the same thing. because as we will see, the very act of distilling inquiry of the material here and now into the subtle bed of the cause can itself be very stilling, satisfying, and dukkha disabling. The opening sutra of the Sankhya Karika, authored by Ishwar Krishna in the 4th century CE, reads something like this. From the disagreeable occurrence of the threefold pain, here commences the inquiry into the means which can prevent it. Nor is this inquiry superfluous, because the ordinary means that do exist fail to accomplish permanent prevention of pain. Amongst the already existing ordinary and impermanent means of remedying dukkha that Sankhya is not convinced about are not only the use of medicinal herbs and gemstones as upayas, but also the Vedic propitiating of gods to evoke their protection to serve rather than their human ends. And it, in fact, even questions the validity of these impermanent Vedic gods, who, as we can see, did prove to be impermanent, as Indra, Varuna, Mitra, who were central to the Rig Veda, have been totally replaced by quite another pantheon of gods and goddesses. In addition, it also rejects the scriptural mode of Vedic sacrifice, calling it impure, wasteful, generative of excess, and also unequal. It is impure due to the practice of animal sacrifice, and unequal due to the inherent agency of an expert, who is always abandoned. In the opinion of the critics, Sankhya is too tedious, and in the opinion of its critics, Sankhya is too tedious and impractical a proposition as to why would a man want to go climb a mountain to find release from pain when he can find a remedy in his own backyard. This argument conversely confirms the Sankhya belief that these modes, the Vedic modes included, only offer remedial options that are not permanent, and B, more importantly, do not tackle the deeper question of existence and how to tap into the suffering-free Sukhi core. What is clear is that some people have, by that time, become impatient with control and woken up to the fact that there has to be more to life than being oppressed and subjected to an existence of suffering. They cannot imagine that suffering could be the intent of the cause that created them. So this whole thing, I just want to say that Sankhya is a philosophy of causation. That it comes down to cause and effect. And I'll just talk a little bit more about cause and effect. So the karta, or the current, the karan is the main thing. So they cannot imagine that suffering could be the intent of the cause that created them. That is, that they could not be born to suffer alone. And also, if they were in fact an effect of the cause, then they could indeed become they could indeed become disposed to the attributes of that cause, and they again cannot associate and then they couldn't associate suffering with that cause. I'll try to explain this a little better in a while. Thus, what initiates this inquiry is an intuitive and assertive disbelief in suffering, and begin to question the tyranny of suffering and the deeply rooted anxiety of how best to evade it. They want to opt out of that kind of living and claim purti, or fulfillment, satisfaction for themselves, as made of life and living. The Charvakas are the first, however, hedonistically, to propose the importance of fulfillment in the here and now. Yavat jivate, sukham jivate. Rinam pitva, dhritam jivate. It says, while alive, let a man live happily. Or in sukha, let him drink ghee, even if he incurs debt. So it's like really being satisfied in the here and now. While elaborating its very detailed distilling methodology of reaching the super-sensible cause, that is the karta or the karana, as well defined, as well as a dukkha-free existence, Sankhya stays very clear of the idea of God or Ishvara, and diligently confines itself within the dynamics of the purely phenomenological world. Thus, it falls squarely within the very squarely within the materialist traditions of causation. I would here like to explain what Sankhya very quickly talks about or proposes. Basically, it says it's about material, and it says it divides material into 20 plus 4 categories, and the 20 are the elements, the senses, the Gyanendriyas, and the Karmendriyas. So this is a combination of 20 things, 20 materials, which are always in flux. So if you imagine a box, and actually Sankhya Karika says it's a house. So there is a house with these 20 things inside, and they're always moving. The fire is moving, the water is moving, the taste is moving. So there's all these things moving, and that is my condition. And then there's a filter of these three things called Manas, Buddhi, and Ahankar. So Sankhya Karika again says these are the three doors through which these 20 are experienced. And I would just like to kind of share here from a point of view of dance as to how this works in dance, because how we treat this 20, because these things, these words sound like words, but the thing is that these are, we live these every day. The senses, the elements, are taste, sound, all these things. So these 20 in a box, if a body is constitutes of these 20, then the manas is the condition that I'm experiencing. That's my manas, that's how I feel. And then this goes to the filter of ahankar. Do I identify with it or I don't identify with it? And then I make a decision with buddhi that whether I let it go or I stick to it. Or how do I distill it? So this whole idea of Sankhya is, Sankhya basically proposes that from matter to spirit, you can distill. And finally, you come to clarity. And I just want to kind of just demonstrate how this might happen in dance, where we create a situation and then distill the situation to let go, basically. In a simple thumri, which might go like ja 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 re ja, to se na bolno, sautane ke ghar ja, right? Which says that I won't talk to you, go to the other woman's house. It's a thumri of a person. So how in this thumri do these two manas, the condition of jealousy, and then the ahankar of do I want to remain jealous or not jealous, and the buddhi of how I let it go is distilled or can be distilled. So it's just a sampling because we live this every day, and we still think that it's a phenomenon. It's like from some other word. These are big words. So just to kind of give you a quick example of, so if I say. You can be so it's like I'm mad at you. Ja ja re ja re to se na bolu sautan ke ghar ja 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 re ja re me to se na bolu sautan ke ghar ja ja re ja re me to se na bolu sautan ke ja ja re ja re me to se na bolu sautan ke ja ja re ja re me to se na bolu sautan ke. So I process this thing of like, saying that you get off my place, I don't care. So I have gone through these phases, these filters of this is my condition, this is happening, these are the juices that are coming to me within me, and this is the given. How do I intelligently process that? And so eventually I want to declutter myself. That's the idea. I want to declutter myself that I don't have the weight of all this stuff in me, and I am released from this condition. And this is how I understand Sankhya in terms of dance. So without going too deep into Sankhya, I'd like to share that just a couple of points that I feel are important and inspiring and relate to my work, both as a yoga practitioner, teacher, and as well as a dancer. The first being that Sankhya built on the law of causation, the dynamics between material, cause and effect, calls for the study and observation of the manifest effect in search of the unmanifest cause. And this effect can even be fabricated in correspondence to a desired cause. I'll explain this. So what it precisely involves then is the arresting or confining of the effect under a lens of mindful observation so that it may reveal the cause. So it's like nothing happens without a cause. And if I want to get to the cause, all I have to do is observe the effect and study the effect so that it percolates down to the cause. And this cause can be as fine as we can, as we want it to be. So, what it precisely involves then is the arresting or confining of the effect under the lens of mindful observation so that it may reveal the cause. Why? Because it believes that the effect, no matter how subtle or intangible, is A, materially real, and thus deserves observation, and B, that the effect potentially already exists in the cause, i.e., that is, it is potentially always pre-existent, or conversely, the potency of the cause is always present in the effect, so it is retractable. All it needs is uninterrupted observation and isolation. But the most important aspect of this theory involving observation of causation is that the cause is always subtler than the effect. That is, if the material effect under observation is fine, then the cause that is instigating it is even subtler. This theory directly informs our arts, our 16 colors, as well as our aesthetic theories. All our arts directly emerge from the material philosophy of Sankhya that promises the methodical process of distilling matter into spirit. It is for this exact reason that our arts are considered spiritual, and not because they feature mythical characters and gods from the Puranas. So I hope I can this is clear that the whole thing is a theory between cause and effect. So if this is the effect, what is causing A, this is real, as opposed to other schools which think that reality is Maya. It says reality, this is real. So if this is real, something is causing it, and what has caused it is in what is seen. What is the unmanifest cause is present in the manifest, tangible effect. So if that is in the tangible, then if we just isolate and observe and meditate upon the tangible, it will lead me into what has caused it. And then it says that if this is tangible, what has caused it is always subtler. So if I keep refining, that's what the art is, if I keep refining the effect, what is causing it is always subtler still. So it is that process of distilling and going deeper and deeper into a subtler cause, which is the whole idea of at least both my practices, both as a yoga practitioner, as a dharma practitioner, that refine the effect, not to show the effect as refined, but to observe the refined effect so that वो मुझे कहीं और ले जाए. The practice of Sankhya then involves the turning of the tables. That is opposed to waiting for the cause to naturally reveal itself, or cause a random effect of which we may be conscious or unmindful. It proposes a practice of drafting or fabricating an effect in search of a corresponding cause. That is, creating an effect with the intention of not showing it, but just using it as a means of introspecting its cause. This practice then highlights yet another complementary component. That is, the quality of the two-pronged effort or yatna that goes into first creating an effect and then simultaneously observing it. This is not some complex esoteric practice. We do it almost daily in our yoga practice as we place attention on the quality of breath that we both exercise and observe. Yatna is a very, very important aspect of Patanjali Yoga. In fact, I sometimes say that Patanjali Yoga is Yatna Yoga. It's not Hat Yoga, it's Yatna Yoga. Because इसमें हम हट नहीं करते. It's the quality of effort that we put into it, which kind of balances on what we call abhyas and vairagya. So we are exerting, we are pushing, at the same time we are we are detached. There's a dispassion to it. There's a vairag in it. So it's a balance between exerting and holding back. That's the effort. That determines the quality of effort that I am breathing, that I'm injecting prana into my posture, so to speak. And that will determine the quality of experience that I will generate. Because the whole idea is that I will generate an experience in my body through practice, through the quality of yatna. If I do Hatha Yoga, if I'm just like pushing with if I'm just overdetermined and doing something, uska effect aur hoga. But if I am exerting with an eye on what it's going to do to me at the same time, the effect is going to be different. And that's what yatna to me is. So it is, Sutra says, tatra sthitau yatno abhyasaha, that in the abhyas vairagya nexus lies the quality of effort that we put in. And that's what we're trying to look at. Before I go any further, I want to add that this exercise of fine calibrating of two-pronged effort of yatna can itself be highly satisfying, fulfilling, and sukha-inducing. I'm slowly getting down to sukha. So this itself, just the practice of very gently, and I'm sure there are many people who practice here with us or on their own, that the act of mindfully observing can itself be very satisfying and very pleasing. And pleasing is a very, very important part of the practice. I'll talk about that. It's called priti. The loveliness of practice. It's the priti of practice. That you love the practice that you're doing. And that itself, the tenderness with which you care about your observation is what's going to give you the pleasant experience. And that is sukh. I won't speak more of Sankhya, but just to reiterate that the two systems of Charvaka and the Sankhya seem to work in tandem. Whereas the strident political stance of Charvaka that rudely calls the bluff of the Brahminical order helps carve a space for the Ishwar-less materialist inquiry. Sankhya offers, on the other hand, Sankhya offers a highly sophisticated methodology of exhaustive delineation of materiality, a system that has withstood the test of time and to date informs all the indigenous systems of India, be it polity, medicine, linguistics, art, yoga, and more, including all our religions and schools of thought, both Nastika and Astika. The main concern at the time of the inquiry of the time is the elimination of dukkha. And dukkha is, as some of you might know, is divided into three types. Dukkha that is caused due to body and mind affliction, that is illness, madness, death, or suffering that due to afflictions by other beings like animals, enemies, etc., or suffering due to afflictions by nature. The very first category of self-suffering is further divided into suffering associated with life processes such as birth, growing old, illness, and dying. Second, suffering due to anxiety caused by a desire to hold on to things. And third, suffering due to a basic unsatisfactoriness of life. So I think these are the three sufferings that we deal with. And we have to kind of, our practices towards elimination of this suffering, which is self-suffering, it's self-inflicted. Whatever the affliction or the experience of the suffering, it was considered to be rooted in karma. Now this is a philosophy, this is a belief in all the systems that suffering comes from karma. And in some cases even accumulated karma from past lives. According to Indian thought, there is no escape from consequences of one's actions and thoughts. Thus life itself is categorically tied into the model of cause and effect. It is because of karma that there is suffering, and in order to stop suffering, the effects of karma have to be stopped, nullified or absorbed. And for this, each of the prevalent schools devised ascetic practices to counter the consequences of past action. I'll give three examples of asceticism, Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist respectively. The Yajnavalkya Smriti proposes that the ascetic, I open quote, should spend the time with fasts regulated by the moon, or he should continuously be engaged in painful exercises, or Alternatively, he should eat when a fortnight has passed, or when a month has passed. Being pure, he should perform asceticism in the midst of 5 fires in the summer, lying on bare ground during the rains, and wearing wet clothes in winter. And he should perform asceticism according to his power. We learn about the Jaina ascetic practices through the questioning of Gautama himself, Gautama Buddha himself. He asked the Jain ascetics, "Why, dear Nigarthas," asks Gautama, "are you standing erect, refusing to eat, refusing to sit down? And why do you experience painful, sharp, severe sensations due to self-inflicted torture?" They answer that the Mahavira, their teacher, has said, open quote, "Formerly, Niganthas, you performed sinful activities. You must exhaust that sinful activity by means of severe and difficult practice. Being here and now restrained in body, speech, and mind amounts to not performing sinful activity in the future." So this is the Jaina model. The Buddha too puts himself through arduous experimentations before he begins to question the popular notion that, quote, "happiness should not be reached through happiness. Happiness should be reached through hardship." The Ekottara Agama narrates the Buddha's experimental meditation without breath and reduced food intake as he talks to the Ajivasena. Ajivasena, he says, recounting his experiments with hunger. This is the Buddha. When I would touch the skin of my belly, I got hold of the backbone. And when thinking I shall touch my backbone, I got hold of the skin of my belly. Since, Ajivasena, the skin of my belly had become stuck to my backbone on account of taking so little food. And at another place he says, "And at that time I thought, now I can eat a residue of the sesame and rice. Then I ate per day 1 seed of sesame and 1 grain of rice." Thus, such self-inflicted pain through various applications of self-control seem to have been a common practice of the time, and still continues to be in some cases, when physical pain or bodily dukkha was considered to be an anecdote for the dukkha on an existential plane. But then something happens in the spring of 589 BCE. The Buddha is awakened. He is enlightened and releases the fallacy and inefficacy of such self-inflicted practices. Once realized, the Buddha makes 2 important proclamations. A, he rejects the idea of pain as a means of liberation, or the painful arresting of movement and even breath as a means of stilling the mind. And B, he declares liberation to be a pleasant experience. This is, to me, momentous. And to this effect, he proposes the practice of 4 dhyanas, or meditations. The 4 dhyanas, according to the Buddhist canon, are, and some of you will recognize them, Vitarka, Vichara, Pitti, and Sukha. So meditate on Vitark, Vichar, Priti. The third is a meditation on Priti, on the loveliness of physical experience, and finally Sukha. And as people who know Yoga Sutras, Patanjali also says the same thing. He's actually kind of verbatim lifting this up. So the replacement of pain with pleasant comfort that included the dismissal of painful motionlessness marks a historical turning point in the history of spirituality. The mindfulness proposed by the Buddha is based on observation of the movement of or turning of thoughts that happens on the screen of the mind. This observation of involuntary, this is the dhyanas that he's talking about. He proposes the mindfulness proposed by the Buddha is based on observation of the movement of the turning, the vritti, the turning of thoughts that happens on the screen of the mind. Thus, observation of involuntary thought movements in the mind becomes a means of stilling the mind. I repeat this. This observation of involuntary thought movements in the mind becomes a means of stilling the mind. This model of dhyana is very radical, not only for the time, but all times to come, and proposes the positioning of the unflinching observing eye in relation to a moving mind screen. So this is the beginning of the model of meditation that we, for all times to come, so to speak. It is in contrast to the steadfast observing eye, unreacting and unattached. So this is vairag, abhyas vairag, abhyas of observing and the vairag of unreacting. It is in contrast to the steadfast observing eye, unreacting and unattached, that the involuntary movement of the mind screen begins to slowly dissipate and lose steam, as it is no longer triggered or provoked. or engaged with. It slows down, disabling the influence of past karma and samskaras or conditioning over it, arriving at a point where the observing eye and mind both become equally stable, empty, and alike. I will now talk of the Yoga Sutras, but before I do, I would like to add the Bhagavad Gita's very lucid comment on the issue of dukkha and karma as well. The Bhagavad Gita in chapter 3 says, "A man does not reach the state freed from activity by not performing actions, and he does not attain perfection by merely abandoning activity. For no one remains without activity even for a moment, because everyone, being powerless, is made to perform activity by the gunas, which are born from original nature or prakriti." So that's the whole idea, that even when we are still, the oceans are churning within us, the fluids are churning within us. So there's nothing called stillness, so to speak. It's how we temper what is moving within us that will affect our stillness. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. I'd also like to add that even though the Bhagavad Gita not only incorporates the Sankhya model, devoting 3 chapters to the concepts of Purusha, Prakriti and the Gunas, but also bases its central theory of karma squarely upon it. The ideal that emerges out of it implies union with God. So this is, I'm just going to explain it. So this is a very interesting point where Sankhya, which is atheist, so to speak, or at least neutral about God, suddenly becomes incorporated into theist Bhagavad Gita. God comes into the picture. So even if he's talking about what he has just said about the gunas, the way Sankhya describes yoga, or Sankhya yoga is described, and the way Bhagavad Gita describes yoga are completely different. In Bhagavad Gita, or in the theistic traditions, yoga means union, and most people think of yoga as union, yoke. But actually in Sankhya and the Yoga Sutras, yoga means separation. Separation between Purusha and Prakriti is yoga, not yoga. Yoga is not union between Purusha and Prakriti. Yoga becomes Purusha and Prakriti, yoga becomes union of Atma Paramatma in Vedanta, or Shiva Shakti in Tantra. But in Sankhya and in Yoga Sutras, yoga is separation. And Kaivalyam, there is absolute separation between the two. So this is a very important twist which gets camouflaged for all time to come. And to my mind, herein lies the seed of an ever-abiding dilemma, if not a conflict, between the theist and the atheist traditions. I will now shift to the Yoga Sutras and that postdate the Bhagavad Gita, and I will begin this section by sharing my initial misgiving that started me off on this trail of inquiry. I want to make it very clear that I'm only sharing a misgiving and not making a statement or proposing anything. I choose to share it because I choose to share this because it serves as a seed to my inquiry and thus has validity, even though it could be unsound, but I'm not so sure if it is. Considering that the idea of dhyana has been so clearly elucidated by the Buddha, we've seen that already, Sankhya has been totally co-opted with the Bhagavad Gita, I began to wonder why Patanjali needed to write Yoga Sutras. Now only in post-sight, after having been through this inquiry that I am now sharing with you, that I realized that it could be to restore yoga back to Sankhya, or at least to offer that option where yoga is Ishvara free. Because essentially that is all Patanjali does, offers the option of yoga without God, or the option without God. This is a very, people who are from the Yoga Sutra tradition would probably understand this better, but this to me is probably the reason why Patanjali does this. Because I was quite troubled as to why he might have had to write the Yoga Sutras and I'll share that with you. But prior to this insight, which at the time seems to make eminent sense to me at this point, my main misgiving was that whether the Yoga Sutra was a commissioned text. And I want to add that even though I seem to have some clarity on this issue, I don't feel that it makes my misgiving altogether redundant. My misgiving was based on 2 speculative reasons. A, unlike other nodal concepts that result out of quite literally centuries of well-documented, very rigorous inquiry, as we have seen in the course of Buddha, Sankhya. We know that there's a whole history of inquiry, centuries, and then suddenly they come to a concept. But in terms of Patanjali, Patanjali out of nowhere gets up and writes this text. There is no history. We have no history of Patanjali. We have a history of Krishna, we have a history of Buddha, we have a history of Mahaprabhu. There are all these histories, but Patanjali is, so that was kind of a little startling to me. Second, Patanjali does not seem to be pushing, that was my initial thing, now I have more clarity. But initially it seemed that Patanjali does not seem to be pushing forward any singular point of view. At least this is the way I see it. So that, so what is he standing for? Because, and as I explained, he's proposing many methodologies, and I'll just share that with you. And three, most importantly, because the Yoga Sutras happen to fall within a historical network of technical texts that quite literally mushroomed around that time due to socio-political reasons. Now it's important to know that these are post-Mauryan times, more precisely post-Ashokan times. And Ashoka has been singularly hostile towards the Brahmins. He has himself converted to Buddhism and sworn to spread it across the subcontinent. He is aggressive in nature. In his drive for Buddhism, he annihilates 18,000 Ajivikas who happen to disagree with the Buddha's teaching. Buddhism does not only succeed in spreading all across the Indian subcontinent, but all the way through China to Korea and Japan in the north and down to Southeast Asia. The teachings of Buddha are radical and empowering and spreading like wildfire. So there is a very concerted and concentrated drive to re-establish the supremacy of the Brahminical order as a threat, because Buddhism is a threat at that point. It is for the first time, and perhaps for this reason, that we suddenly have technical texts that can give technique of practice, replication, and implementation that emerge in India. To name some of these texts that emerge are the Arthashastra, the Brahma Sutras, Manusmriti, and all these texts can be problematic texts. Manusmriti, Arthashastra, and others even like the Natya Shastra. And I have problems with the Natya Shastra too, because I see it as a text of a propaganda theatre. I can talk to my dancer friends later on about this. All these texts seem to work from the premise of control. So if the Yoga Sutras emerge within the company of such texts, could they be as innocent as we might want them to imagine? I began to wonder if the sutras were written to co-opt, and then I began to wonder if the Yoga Sutras were written to co-opt Buddha's dhyana within the Brahminical fold. And I think this is something that we can still consider. With the singular proposition of dhyana, which is highly radical and equalizing, that is non-hierarchical, thus hugely attractive, the Buddha seems to have trumped the Brahmins, and he has. So could Patanjali the grammarian be propositioned with the task to put his grammarian skills to good use and put together a text that would couch dhyana within theistic Sankhya? That Patanjali is indeed a grammarian seems very likely, as there is a striking stylistic similarity between the Yoga Sutras and the Mahabhashya, a commentary on Panini's primary text on Sanskrit grammar that he said to have authored. The opening Yoga Sutra, as most of you would know, is Atha Yoga Anushasanam, while the Mahabhashya opens with Atha Shabda Anushasanam. So it's stylistically the same. The use of Atha as a commencement of elucidated text as opposed to the evocation of a god or a deity is commonly done, seems to originally be a Sankhya model, or Sankhya method, as the Sankhya Pravachana Sutras also begin with Atha. Thus, this once again points to the fact that Patanjali is a follower of Sankhya. The Yoga Sutras too are plainly indicative of that. In fact, the text is often called the text of Sankhya Yoga, and with the option of Ishvara. If you look at the sutras from one remove, we see that Patanjali is proposing a number of philosophical methodologies, which can be confusing, compounded by the fact that the text is so dense and cryptic. There are many who have found it contradictory and frustrating. In fact, Dr. Radhakrishnan, for one, rejects it, calling it incoherent. Using a layman's analysis, let us try and list the various methodologies that he does present. It is quite clear that he is presenting Sankhya, but with the option of Ishvara. In the first chapter, he says, Ishvara pranidhanad va, meaning that the practitioner can surrender to Ishvara or can choose not to. and practice the path offered in the sutras. So this is very, very important. He clearly gives you an option of believing in Ishvara or not. In the first chapter, which is called the Samadhipada, he offers the model of the four dhyanas, leading to pragya and subsequently to samadhi, which is directly derived from the Buddhist canon, verbatim. At the end of the same chapter, he divides samadhi into six parts, beginning with Sarvatarka Samadhi, to the highest order of samadhi, that is Nirbija Samadhi. Samadhi with absolutely no objective mooring, which excludes even the idea of God, thus again Buddhist. In the second half of the first chapter, he proposes the threefold model of Brahma Viharas. Brahma Viharas, again, if I tell you, where they again come from the Buddhist canon. He proposes Brahma Viharas are basically good conduct. Maitri, Karuna, Upekha, Upeksha and Mudita. Along with that, in that model, he gives a threefold model. So, Brahma Viharas, which is like behave yourself basically, do pranayam, and do inquiry. So this is a model. This is a complete model in itself. Behave yourself, make sure that you don't clutter your head and spoil your relationships and complicate lives. Do pranayama practice, and always have a mode of inquiry. I mean, he presses on inquiry. He says to be without inquiry is dangerous. So you must, even if you have nothing, create some inquiry. And this, he proposes this in lieu of believing in God. Either believe in God or you can do this. Then in the second chapter, called Sadhana Pada, which is perfection, it offers the model of Kriya Yoga, which mirrors the teaching of the Bhagavad Gita. Proposes avidya as the root of suffering, and I'll come back to this in a second. It also then offers the 8 limbs of yoga, as we all know. That's the most popular thing that comes out of yoga is the Ashtanga, the 8 limbs of yoga. While taking a second look at the material listed above, it seems to emerge, and this I am proposing, as this is not a misgiving, I'm proposing this very, very deliberately, that perhaps the thrust of the first chapter is Buddhist, and the second chapter is from the perspective of Vedanta. Thus, he is offering a choice between the Buddhist model, which is closer to Sankhya, without Ishvara, and then the Vedanta model, which is with Ishvara. According to Buddha, the cause of suffering is Trishna. This is important. According to Buddha, so Vedantists say the cause of suffering is avidya. According to Buddha, it's Trishna. Trishna is the pyas of the body, literally. Like I just showed, there are these things happening in my body. The gunas are churning, and so it's a thirsty body, so to speak. So it's the thirst in the body that makes me identify wrongly, so to speak. So the first chapter, while talking of vairagya or dispassion, talks of disabling or dethirsting this Trishna. It is very clear in the Yoga Sutras. It says you either do, there are 2 vairagyas. One is Vashikara Vairagya, which is or Vishya Vairagya, that you create detachment from a Vishaya or an object. And the other is Guna Vairagya, कि अपने गुणों की जो तुम्हारे अंदर गुण की chemistry है, उसकी प्यास बुझा दो. Guna Vaitrishnam. So if I am made up of these gunas, I'll talk about this in a bit, that if I am made up of the gunas, then I'll just quickly talk about the gunas. The gunas are, like I said, it's a box in which there are these 20 things of senses and elements and stuff. That's the stuff. But that stuff then is churned through three gunas. And these gunas are tendencies. These are substances, or I call them juices. And one is a slothful juice, one is an aggressive juice, and one is a sattvic juice. And I just kind of try to explain how I understand this, because I don't think if we can understand yoga at all without understanding how these things work. So, this is the body. the idea of a yoga practice, that we somehow calibrate the practice in such a way that we make sure that you are alert and you've counted the slot by aggressive, by energetic asana, by very alert asana. At the same time, we've also used the breath and the counter poses in such a fashion that you have been exhausted and calmed down of that speed. So if it's a gridlock like this, the practice of, I call it energizing / exhausting practice. It's a practice with both those things working, depending on what the body is. So the gridlock of tapas and rajas begins to release when the sloth has been energized enough and the speed has been exhausted enough. And once that they release, sattva, whose nature is buoyant, begins to rise. And that's when we wake up after a good shavasana and say, wow, that feeling is sattva has risen. And it's not some esoteric thing, it happens to all of us on the yoga mat. By the time we get up, you're like, man, that was sweet. And it's not because we've done something esoteric, we've just used the material of the body. Samkhya. We've used the material of the body, the juices of the body in such a fashion that we have disabled the two gunas, so that the third rises. The question that I'm going to pose later on is, what do we do with this risen sattva? Because this is a very sukhi moment. We have actually generated sukh in the body. Anybody who goes to yoga class would know that at the end of a class, if the class has been good, you feel really sweet sukh. It's sensual sukh. It's not clinical sukh. It's not mental thing. You're really you feel nice about yourself. Why I'm saying what do we do with it is because sattva is not only buoyant, sattva is also luminous. It can reflect another dimension. The whole idea of prajna, this is a beautiful concept of prajna, which is a Buddhist concept. It says that a moment when the penny drops, it's an insight. Prajna is called wisdom, but prajna is a moment when the penny drops. And the penny doesn't drop out of thinking and brooding. The penny drops when suddenly the body chemistry is changing. So wow. And suddenly, a flash. That's prajna. It comes like out of nowhere. The penny drops out of nowhere. You don't have to think hard to have the penny drop. The penny drops because you have created a conducive condition in the body. And suddenly you say, wow, I understand that. And I'm good. We all know that. People who come to a yoga mat and leave, I always say this. When you leave, first of all, you're feeling so good that you won't bite the bait for a while. You won't be provoked. You won't follow your compulsions for a while because you're feeling too good to destroy it. It's a common practice. It's a common knowledge of yoga practitioners. And second, if you live with it and you begin to pose questions, that's very important. If you start also posing questions along with this practice, then suddenly things begin to reveal and say, I understand that now. Just because your mind is becoming uncluttered and you're becoming relaxed and you're actually inquiring as opposed to thinking and projecting, you're just kind of open-minded and inquiring. So it's not a mental thing. You have changed the chemistry of the body through physical practice, through mind, body, breath practice. Okay. Back to so that is Krishna. The practice से body की Krishna बुझानी है. Disable बुझानी नहीं है, disable करनी है. It's disabling of it. And then something will happen. So, why I'm saying that the first chapter is Buddhist. The four dhyanas, vitar, vichar, asmita. Buddha says vitar, vichar, priti, sukha. Patanjali says vitar, vichar, ananda, asmita. So, of course, he's taken it out from sukh to anand. He's pushed the adjective from sukh to anand. He's orange ko badha diya. So, it's not just sukh, it is bliss. Second, he's called, this is only for people who know the Yoga Sutras. Shraddha, Virya, Smriti, Samadhi, Prajna is lifted from the Buddhist canon. The Brahma Viharas are lifted from the Buddhist canon. The six Samadhis is, the Nirbij Samadhi is complete. The idea of Samadhi is Buddhist. And even though he offers a detailed definition of Ishvara in the first chapter, he very clearly gives you the option of not believing in Ishvara. clearly. The second chapter is Sadhana Path, or the path of perfection, in which he begins, the very first sutra is Kriya Yoga, which is Bhagavad Gita. It comes from the Bhagavad Gita. He talks of avidya as the cause of dukkha, which is, he talks of the 8 limbs and we know the 8 limbs, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, all those things. And he proposes, he only talks about the 5 limbs in this chapter, and I'll tell you why he does that. So basically in this chapter, I'm going to edit this now. In the second chapter, there are all these self-policing things, which in the first chapter there are not. There is brahmacharya, there is pratyahara, there is tapas. These are all Brahminical modes. Self-policing, self-controlling. In the first chapter, there's nothing like that. First chapter is Krishna Bujhao. Here you are monitoring yourself. And so, what he does is, the Ashtanga, the 8 limbs that he has, he only puts 5 in the second chapter. And then the third chapter has the last 3, which are common to both Buddhist and Hindu, or Brahminical. So the third chapter is Dharana, Dhyana, Samadhi, which are common to both. But Pratyahara, Pranayama, Asana, Yama, Niyama, which has Brahmacharya and all those things, are within the second chapter. And I don't want to go as far as to say that, you either do the chapter 1 or chapter 2, but there is a distinct separation between the two. So what I'm proposing is that Patanjali offers, in my opinion, us an option. A lot pivots on that one little word, va, meaning or. Believe in God or not, which gives us the freedom to believe in God or not. Be astika or nastika, and then accordingly follow our path, Sankhya, Buddhist or Vedanta. I reiterate that what he's offering is in the Yoga Sutras, which to my mind reads like a cut and paste text. It actually is, because he's lifted things verbatim from other canons. What he's offering is choice. This is perhaps the only text that offers you choice. Do this or do that, and without any judgment. His signature does not lie in the various philosophies that he is offering, often verbatim, but in that one very radical word, va. If Patanjali writes the text on his own initiative, then he is doing so to most respectfully retract and reproposition the Sankhya definition of yoga to mean separation as opposed to union. Because he is not going with the union definition. And to reassert the option of no God as opposed to with God. And if indeed he is sponsored, he does a pretty good job, but not a perfect one. Because the inclusion of that one word va makes the entire text indigestible for the theists for all time to come. But whatever be the case, what comes out very clear is that he remains steadfastly true to Sankhya. This is for people who are with the Yoga Sutras. I think we have to be very clear that he is first of all a Sankhya person. And that's what he believes. That is what his creed is. There are several commentaries written of the Yoga Sutras over the past 2000 years. Vyasa, Shankara, Bhoja, Vachaspati, Vijnana Bhikshu being some of the prominent ones. All of them are theistic, if not Vedantic, in nature, and all primarily jostle around the question of Ishvara. They just can't get around this idea of Ishvara, trying to see if and how to best accommodate it or to interpret it within the theistic fold. One way of doing is by convincingly interpreting Ishvara as Vishnu. This happens by the 6th, 8th centuries. This starts happening. Vijnana Bhikshu goes as far as calling it Krishna. But the idea of leaving Ishvara as optional still frustrates them. I would say that by planting that word va in the sutras, Patanjali has created something akin to a Kashmir ka masla for the theists. Really. Because iska koi hal nahi hai. I would also like to assert that perhaps the Yoga Sutras are still alive as an independent text and school of thought because of their very option of Ishvara. Sankhya, which is unstatedly atheist, gets completely absorbed into the theist doctrine of the Bhagavad Gita, and in a way that marks the end of its independence. Today it is totally forgotten or totally camouflaged. But the Yoga Sutras cannot be accommodated and adjusted well within the theistic doctrine. Therefore, they are still due to the unrest, interest, inspiration, and most of all the frustration that they stir, that they are still living, and they are with us. Another interesting development that takes place around the 6th century is that Patanjali gets imagined as an avatar of Ananta, the serpent upon which Vishnu reclines. This is attributed to the Vishnu Dharmottara Purana, and then later picked up by Yagnavalkya in the south of India and King Bhoja, who writes the invocation to Patanjali in which he decorates him with Vaishnav symbols of Shankha and Chakra. I must say that I was shocked when I first heard this prayer in an Iyengar class in New York many years ago. I had never heard this prayer or the story of Patanjali being Vaishnav through all my years of training with Desikachar.
The Iyengars will make everybody.
Sir. Though it has become part of though it has now become part of the teaching of the Kevaim. I found the idea of imposing religious iconography upon a personage like Patanjali problematic, if not offensive. A person who does not only impose any idea of God or religion, but most importantly does not even divulge his creed. He keeps his personal creed anonymous. So painting him Vaishnav seemed both manipulative and a direct violation of his primary intent. And I hold this view even more strongly today. More so because such ideas contribute greatly to the sentimentalism of true believers, which to my mind is an antithesis to the clarity and neutrality that Patanjali so assiduously offers. As an aside, I simply want to kind of also say that, somewhere along the line, Buddha also becomes part of the Dashavatar. Kab hua, kaise hua, this is all, part of the... Without going deeper into the theist's long and abiding love-hate relationship with the Yoga Sutras, I would just like to cite the responses of one of the Vaishnava commentators. And for this, I quote from the works of one of my most favorite authors, Edwin Gordon White, who has written extensively and most insightfully on the history of yoga, tantra, and alchemy. In his latest book, The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, a biography, he summarizes the response of Ramanuja, a 14th century Vaishnava scholar. He says, Ramanuja criticized several of the Yoga Sutra's philosophical conditions, including its metaphysical dualism and its goals. A biography of the isolation of spirit from nature, its view of the nature of the soul and of Ishvara, and the validity of direct yogic perception as a valid cognition and an unerring source of knowledge. He also rejected the Yoga Sutra's goals, refusing to admit either the supernatural powers of samadhi. A staunch theist and a fundamentalist in respect to scripture, Ramanuja's interest in the Yoga Sutras was practice, how to put its 8-part practice to use as a means to the supreme end of devotion to God. It was to this purpose that he prescribed the techniques of posture, breath control, and retraction of the senses as presented in the 8-parts practice. He also prescribed meditation, but with an important, and this is very important, but with an important caveat. It was not the technique of meditation that led to liberation, which according to which both Yoga Sutras, Sankhya and Buddha says, but rather its object, which for Ramanuja could only be God. So its meditation of breath meditation, as we do in pranayama, is not enough. It has to be on an object, and for that is God. And on this ground, it is mainly on this ground that Vedanta continuously keeps rejecting the Yoga Sutras, and at the same time wants to cooperate. And there's this continuous tiff between the two. I purposely choose to cite Ramanuja, and this is for people who are from my tradition, because he's closer home to some of us present today. My grand guru Sri T. Krishnamacharya is claimed to be the direct descendant of a 9th century Sri Vaishnava saint, Nath Muni, and Ramanuja happens to be in the same line. So Ramanuja is a descendant of Nath Muni, and so is Krishnamacharya. Thus we say that we are from the same lineage. Krishnamacharya too is a devout Vaishnava. He too advocated devotion to God, but he's equally established in Sankhya and Mimamsa. I quote from the Dhyana Malika that he authored. He says, the teachers who claim all is an illusion don't accept duality, but Yoga and Sankhya proclaim that there is Purusha and it is the enjoyer. That is, So it is, Sankhya is dualist. Vedanta becomes Advaita. Whereas most of the commentators have been, so refuting, he goes further. Refuting the Nirguna philosophy, he says, when nature is of the three gunas, how can there be nothing to enjoy? So this is coming back to nature, Prakriti. If nature is of three gunas, how can there be nothing to enjoy? And in that he disagrees with none other than Shankara himself. Shankara is one of the commentators, saying, why then Shankara insists on Nirguna is unclear. So even he is questioning these commentators. Because for us, it is Saguna. हम निर्गुण नहीं है, जो हमारा tradition है. It is, everything is within the gunas. And gun doesn't mean the, gun means these three things, these three substances which we can disable and use as reflectors, so to speak. As Sattva becomes a reflector to reveal another dimension. My teacher, T.K.V. Desakachar, decided to take up yoga in the early 60s. And as he appealed to his illustrious father, and he is Krishnamacharya's son, to take him as a disciple, he also placed a condition. And the condition was to keep God out of it. So this is a very radical thing. This in the 60s, a 20+ old Brahmin boy telling a very orthodox Vaishnava father, saying, teach me yoga but keep God out of it. So all my years of training at with Desakachar, there was no God, there was no Om, there was no deity, nothing. And Krishnamacharya readily agrees to the condition. And thus the lineage continues going from one Astika generation to the next Nastika generation. And so this is very fluid, from Astika to Nastika, without a batting an eye. So for me the power of the sutras, which I love and feel very free to question, just as an adult son can question and even disagree with the father, lies in not so much so in the methodologies that it lists. I use the word lists because it's actually listing things, it's not proposing things. But it lies primarily in the fundamental freedom that the text openly offers. To me, the word va stands next to and as tall as the word atha, the opening atha yoga anushasana. Atha is almost like Om for us. To me, we must remember that a sutra is not a we must also remember that a sutra is not a shastra. This is a very clear distinction. A sutra is not a shastra or a doctrine that one follows unquestioningly, but literally a thread that one holds to follow through an explorative journey of inquiry, unraveling and questioning. So ये बहुत बड़ा distinction है शास्त्र और सूत्र में. हमें सूत्र में हमें हाथ में literally thread पकड़ा देते हैं कि अब जाके unravel the whole, the pattern, so to speak. So you follow a thread into unraveling a pattern, as opposed to being told to. A shastra tells you and you have to obey. But a sutra actually gives you the freedom to, so it's autonomous. It gives you autonomy. The Shastra assumes an authority in ways that the Sutra actively grants and facilitates autonomy. It offers freedom to experiment, question, and realize through trial, error, observation, and insight. Are you? Okay, I'm just going to not read. I just conclude. So what I'm okay.
You pull all the threads.
So, anyways, I'm just going to reiterate what I've been trying to say, because this is actually already I've pulled in from a lot of stuff that I've been writing. So what I've been doing, I am first of all tracing the genealogy of Sukha, as opposed to painful self-inflicted tapas. So there's a whole tradition of Sukh as transformative, as the agent of transformation that begins to emerge, beginning with the Buddha. He kind of totally demolishes this whole idea of suffering as a means to liberation and places it with pleasant Priti and Sukha. What lovely, how beautiful is that? Preeti and Sukh become the agents of transformation as opposed to pain and self-infliction. This is radical. No wonder this would spread like wildfire. So there's a genealogy there. Then I'm trying to say that these Nastika traditions they give us autonomy. It is not, we are not told to, but we are offered autonomy to explore, to question. And Sankhya is central to that. I talk also about, I haven't talked about it, but I'd like to explain it. So what happens is that when we work with the gunas, where if I have done a very good practice, where I have actually worked with the gunas, I have disabled the gunas and I've worked. But it is this whole thing of not policing, but disabling. There's a huge distinction here. We disable the Krishna. We can. I promise you that. That I can promise you as a practitioner and as a yoga instructor, that I can disable your Krishna for a while. But the policing is what we are, so I'm contrasting that to policing. So I highlight the autonomy and freedom that Patanjali offers. And Patanjali offers that in a platter. Plus he offers the freedom of believing in God or not believing in God. I also talk about the abiding tension between the Shastra and the Sutra, the theist and the atheist, and the various theist attempts to co-opt the Yoga Sutras. What I'm not able to share right now is how Yoga Sutras get rediscovered in the 19th century. They are lost for at least 3 centuries or 4 centuries. They get rediscovered, and it's the British who rediscover them. And why do they rediscover them? Because it's the end of the 17th century. No, I have to count. It's the beginning of the 18th century, and they have to make Hindu law. And to make Hindu law, effective Hindu law, they need to actually understand the Hindu ethos. So they're trying to hunt for all the texts to understand the Hindu code, so they can effectively implement Hindu law and rule effectively. So it is in this point where all the texts, including the Natya Shastra, Yoga Sutra, are rediscovered. Yoga Sutra, I know, is rediscovered after at least its last commented upon in the 16th century. From the 16th century onwards, Yoga Sutra has disappeared. In fact, Patanjali school has disappeared, if not gone into disrepute. There's a lot of, because Hatha Yoga, Tantra Yoga is on top, and Patanjali is gone. So they're discovered, and then because in the 19th century there's Max Muller, a Lutheran, a Protestant, there is, so this whole thing of going back to the text starts happening, which is a very Protestant tenet of take it back to the text, to the source, to the origin. So all these texts, Max Muller takes it back to the Vedas. He's a philologist. Rukmini Devi takes it back to Natya Shastra. Vivekananda and Krishnamacharya take it to Yoga Sutra. So everything that is the what you call the existing cultural practices that are happening, those are totally obliterated, but they want to align to the pure original text. This whole obsession with purity, authenticity, root race. If people know what this whole thing of eugenics, root race, which leads to ethnic purity, ethnic cleansing. These are all obsessions of purity of body, purity of physique. This whole thing of there's a whole thing of muscular Christianity that happens in the 19th century in England, where they suddenly feel that the body has to be physically fit to be spiritual. So they start making muscling up, literally, and Vivekananda takes this up, muscling up of the body to be spiritual and ethical. And then the sports and the reform movements in athletic schools and the public schools starts there. And then that is picked up by the Maharaja of Mysore, who is inspired by the Raja of Tanjore, who has been groomed and tutored by a Lutheran minister. So there is this Lutheran Protestant influence happening. So in 1933, in the palace of Mysore Raja, a Vyayam Shala is opened, a gym is opened for the princes to muscle up. And then 2 years later, the Krishnamacharya starts the Yoga Shala in the same Mysore palace. And 2 years later, in the Theosophical Society, Rukmini Devi starts the School for Bharatanatyam. So they're both, and I'm kind of in the middle of both these things. So Theosophical Society promotes the, going back to the Natya Shastra, the revival of Bharatanatyam, cleansed Bharatanatyam, totally cleansed, and the Mysore Raja starts the Yoga Shala with Krishnamacharya with completely cleansed. I mean, if you think Bharatanatyam was cleansed, yoga was cleansed even more. It was completely, Vivekananda says, he's completely against Hatha Yoga. Vivekananda absolutely can't, because Hatha Yogis are very embarrassing. They are like, they are these naked fakirs running around, and they are doing all kinds of odd practices, sexual practices, and they are really, really like quite embarrassing. So he kind of goes, in fact, many of the reformists go on rampage against Hatha Yoga and say, and Vivekananda actually goes as far as saying, anything that the Hatha Yogis propose should be rejected because mystery mongering, this is a big quote from him, mystery mongering weakens the brain. And on this ground, he rejects Hatha Yoga and promotes Patanjali Yoga. And for the first time, the Patanjali Yoga is coming back to India. So Raj Yoga that he proposes is on Patanjali. But interestingly, many of the practices that he actually proposes are Hatha and Tantra, even though he's saying it's Patanjali. So there is this revival, and I call it, yoga and dance become domesticated. So we are doing domestic yoga, literally. Coming down to it. It's middle class domestic yoga, number one. And number two, the whole 19th century grand revival makes us into true believers. So we are 8 true believers and 2 doing domestic yoga. And that's it's not a mix that actually lets you go down to the depths of it. And the reason that I wrote all this I'm writing is because coming down to Sukh, right now Sukh is the most important thing for me in practice. Because I generate it. My teachers, my students generate it. I see it happening in front of me. But my frustration is, what do we do with this Sukh? Because literally, this is where I'm sharing. I see these people lying on the mat. I have generated juices in their bodies. Literally. They are palpable. I can see that they're sinking. But how far do we allow ourselves to sink into Sukh is the question. Because I feel we don't allow ourselves to go too deep. This is actually the reason why I'm doing all this. Because it frustrates me to see people lying on those mats, resisting. And my question is, what is it? And it's also, I call them, there are many nets, it feels like the body can go much deeper, but they get caught in nets. And the first net is a gender net, morality net, domesticity net, responsibility net, image net, spirituality net. Some embellish it with spirituality and say, oh, I'm seeing Ganesha, I'm seeing Vishnu or something. The others don't find it necessary to go deeper. Literally, it's a choice. People just think that this is not necessary. Kaam to ho gaya na? Kar liya, ab shavasana kyun karwa rahe ho? Literally. And I tell you what happens. When these gunas are, we do them, we work with them, And when you lie down in Shavasana, my analogy that I always give is that, I have stirred the body. It's like I'm shaking the carpet. I shake the carpet and I place it back to the floor. And the dust that's flown out of the carpet begins to resettle in the carpet. And it will settle down in a new configuration. And that's change.
On that note, you must end. Because they're standing over there desperate because we have the place only till 8 o'clock. And I don't want to preempt the possibility of a couple of questions at least. And let me do that, and then I might bring in a couple of things that one can say by conclusion. So if there's any question here, yeah. And I'll take only two. Okay, yeah. You first and you next. That's, yeah. And then you can carry on the discussion outside, okay? Yeah.
जगदीश भट्ट बोल रहा हूँ और मैं होलिस्टिक साइंस का स्टूडेंट नृत्य शास्त्र और योग शास्त्र में आध्यात्म की ओर कौन सा आपको जल्दी ले जाता है कि आपके अपने अनुभव क्या है?
हाँ, ठीक है। रुक जाइए, दोनों ले लेते हैं, एक साथ ले लेते हैं।
So about the Charvakas, who were they specific? Who were the Charvakas? Were they a specific community, a tribe, a caste, or after they could not have been just a set of ideas? Because
No, they were a sect, a very, very strong sect.
only in terms of sect, a tribe or caste, because a sect would not be able to politically challenge any other community, particularly the Brahmins at that time. You would need political power to so overtly, not just a matter of fortune.
I might not be able to answer that question.
I'll take that.
Yeah, you take that?
Yeah.
Okay. Because she's a student, she'll do that. Okay, so.
But you go ahead
Yeah.
and answer that.
That's a very आपका क्वेश्चन जो है कि ज़्यादा ये तो डिपेंड करता है, कुछ भी आध्यात्मिक हो सकता है, यहाँ बैठना भी आध्यात्मिक हो सकता है, सो इससे कि डांस या योगा ज़्यादा आध्यात्मिक है,
आनंद देते हैं।
हाँ दोनों चीज़ें आनंद देती हैं।
अपनी अपनी जगह और reconcile करें तो बहुत ही और बढ़िया है। Can bring the two together.
Yeah.
वही तो हो रहा है। इसीलिए 1.5 घंटे मग्न हो गए अपने। I'll just to so that we don't overstretch the time, I'll make a few comments, and then you can certainly carry on this discussion outside. I don't think there'll be anything to. You can see how engrossed Navtej is in his attempt, in his inquiry, and his attempt to understand a text as well as a tradition that he, as well as a discipline that he's practicing. And I really enjoyed it, the mode in which you lead your inquiry. And I can see also that these are ways of engaging with the text which are also a response to both yourself as an individual but also the times that we're living in. Because if that's very, that the location of the time is actually extremely important, because there is a way in which inquiry itself is being sought to be stifled. You're not allowed to actually inquire, and if you're going to inquire into texts and the tradition that is supposed to be sort of like written in stone, then you get bashed up and you get your face sort of painted and stuff like that, and all that is also happening. So I think what's really interesting is that both the personal and the contemporary situation brought together in a very interesting way in exploring a text in which Navtej is so invested, because this is the text that he's also trying to practice. Now I was struck by, there are only a couple of things I'd like to say here. The 6th century BC, which is actually a critical moment, and Brihaspati you're saying is 8th century. So you're actually predating, you're taking it back to the age of the Buddha. And yes, surely I'm sure that the Charvaka mode of inquiry is very early, and it is an attempt to challenge the mode in which the orthodoxy, and let's put it as the attempt to close inquiry, because if you're going to say this is how it was, this is sacred, and everything else is not acceptable. And leading to this whole thing of the orthodox and the heterodox, and those are no use from our point of view, because in a sense the orthodox or the attempt to seek the orthodox is always challenged at the moment of its birth. It doesn't have to wait. You don't wait till the 19th century. You wait. There is a challenge that is happening right at that moment, and the 8th century text that Brihaspati that you're talking about is indicating that as you try and mystify reality, we will tell you what is real. Or I will tell you, I will challenge that, and I'll give you another kind of reality. So that's actually very important. But the 6th century BC is significant, or let's say from 8th on to about 3rd century BC. It's an extremely critical moment because there is a fantastic moment of searching and looking for answers. And there are all kinds of questions that are being posed. So that's a really exciting moment, and the Buddha's the Buddha's location at that time is significant and interesting. Now the problem with the question of the Charvakas, for instance, is that the Charvakas have not been able to leave behind the real textual tradition that they should. You get them in fragments. So the Charvakas actually exist in the rebuttal. They don't exist in the in their own text. So they're all. So if you're rebutting them, who's challenging them? Who's trying to counter them? It's the Brahmanical tradition that's trying to shut them up. So when they're trying to shut them up, they will necessarily trivialize them. So it is a completely trivialized version of their philosophy that has been put in. So this, they've been reduced to eat, drink, and be merry because there's nothing else. But actually, they are They are posing a direct challenge to the way in which authority is being hammered down, and every political power, sacred power, every kind of power is being used to do that. So in that sense, I think it's an extremely important tradition that we need to, and we must remember that when Yudhishthira is being crowned, it's a Charvak who gets up and says to him, "What's the point of your kingship? You've killed everybody. You've killed your own relatives." So the questions that are being posed to those who are seeking to establish a certain kind of orthodoxy is really, you may say that is the Charvaka tradition, and today's Charvakas will be those who will similarly, challenge the way in which hegemonic traditions are being lobbed on you. So I think that's an important issue. Now I think that the other two issues, it's very interesting the way you developed your discussion. One thing about Ashoka, I think Ashoka is really critical. Buddha is important, but so is Ashoka. Because Ashoka is the man who had the political power. And once you have political power, you create a certain kind of possibility of bringing a mode of thinking and state power into the same frame. And what Buddhism is in India, it is not in Sri Lanka. It is horrendously distorted in places where it is tied up with political power. So all that we valorize in the Buddha is something that's not available because there it functions as the orthodoxy. You can't ask the certain kinds of questions. The Buddha went to Sri Lanka, that's established canon as far as they are concerned. So you can't ask this question, okay, no, but how could he have done that, So I think, but Ashoka is actually very important because having brought ethics and state power together in his transformed version, and I'm not sure it was a real transformation, and perhaps it was a very pragmatic transformation. Nevertheless, it does give you a certain kind of challenge to the established way in which the king-Brahmana duo functioned in the Brahmanical system. Now that led to various textual traditions trying to engage with this phenomenon. And that was what has led to, for instance, Yudhishthira, the Mahabharata is a fantastic text because it allows you to do all sorts of things. And Yudhishthira's rebirth, his own persona, the way he's constructed, is very much an answer to the Buddhists in terms of it's now the Brahmanical ethical king who has a certain mode of leading his Rajdharma. So in a sense you have to reinterpret, because the challenge has been to rethink the way in which you're going to hold political power and ethical questions together. And I think that's significant over there. Now, what I'll end with is Patanjali Shastra's attempt to, and use of Va, can also suggest that there is an internal contradiction in the text. Because chapter 1 is Buddhist, chapter 2 is Brahmanical. So there's an internal contradiction in the text at which the Va allows you to pose. And so, in a sense, he might give you the option that you can put in the God and you can give out the God. And all reconcilers try to do that. And reconciling is actually the biggest thing that the Buddha is telling you. He says, there is another path. And the dialectic, I mean, that's where the dialectic comes in. So it's the thesis, antithesis, and बीच का रास्ता भी है. और वो बीच का रास्ता तुम चुन लो, तुम अपने आप करो. You find your way. And so that's one way in which that text is leaving you to answer and practice. If it's a thread, it's a thread that we can interpret and we can carry the way we want. And I think that's where the power of the text might lie. Thank you very much, all of you, for your, sort of enjoying of this session. And I hope I answered your question a little bit.